So this is the Wasatch Front Oquirrh Alluvial Fan Inventory webinar. This project was developed for the Utah DEM as part of our risk map program and was prepared by J.E. Fuller, hydrology and geomorphology experts. Jamie Huff is unfortunately not able to join us today as she's come down with a flu. However, she is on the webinar listening in to us. My name is Tracy Harrison, and I have likely met some of you already at the meeting, but I have been working with Jamie and the risk map program here at the Division of Emergency Management. Mike, who is going to be presenting, is a geomorphologist and principal with J.E. Fuller, Inc. He has over 18 years of experience in geomorphologic, hydraulic, and water resource studies and projects throughout the western U.S. and internationally. Mike contributed routinely to our USMA conferences, and we are happy to have him with us here today. So, why Utah needs this inventory? According to our U.S. Census, Utah is ranked number 1 in population growth from year 2015 to 2016. With growth, areas for development are becoming limited in the valley and lower elevations, especially around the Great Salt Lake, so development pressures appear to be moving towards the foothill. But within Utah, only 7.8% of all flood risk is mapped. This is areas that have debris flow hazards. I want to repeat that. Only 7.8% of all flood risk is mapped in Utah. And if areas happen to be mapped, large portions are outdated or can be mapped inaccurately, especially that with a Zone A designation. So we're going to show you an example of Ness Creek in Salt Lake County. After doing a more detailed analysis, we can see that there is a way to better define alluvial fan hazards rather than providing a general area of possible risk. And if you can flip the next one on that one, Mike. There we go. That's our better defined risk. So, with the increased development pressures and inaccurate or no flood risk identified, the DEM initiated a study to determine where the alluvial landforms are located to determine the scope of risk. So if you want to flip to the next one. The study was funded through FEMA CTP grant, and it includes the areas you see here, the Wasatch Front from the Idaho border to Nephi, and the west side of Oquirrh from Lake Point to southeast of Rush Valley. Before we go into the study results, for those of you who are unfamiliar with alluvial fans, I want to identify what an alluvial fan is. These are areas located at the base of the mouth of the canyon where debris and sediment have deposited into fan-like shapes due to historic high-velocity floods. Once the debris and flood of water reaches the mouth of the canyon, there's typically no defined channel to move the water and debris, and the flow path becomes uncertain. As the sediment and debris like the tree trunks and boulders move down the flow path, they can block an area causing water to move to different locations, which is why they look like fans. The water will basically go where it wants to go. There are two characteristics for alluvial fans, an active and inactive as defined by FEMA. Active fans are younger, there's deposition like sediment, rounded boulders, large tree trunks, etc. And there's not a defined channel that you would likely see in your typical river channel. Just to reiterate, these are areas that are located at the base of the mountain canyons where the debris and sediment have deposited into that fan-like shape due to the historic high-velocity floods. Once that debris and floodwater reaches the mouth of the canyon, there's typically no defined channel to move the water and debris, and the path becomes uncertain. So as the sediment and debris like tree trunks and boulders kind of move down that flow path, they can plug the area causing the water to move in different locations, which is why they look like fans, as the water kind of has a tendency to go where it wants to go. So the two characteristics of the alluvial fans that we're looking at is the active fans, which are younger. There's deposition like settlement of rounded boulders and large tree trunks, etc. And there's not a defined channel that would likely see in a typical river channel. The other is the inactive fans, and these are older, a channel's been defined, and there's been some kind of mitigation structure developed, maybe like a debris basin, to minimize the debris flow risk. These areas are dangerous and can produce high velocity floods and debris flows like a flash flood. So as you can see, this picture of Death Valley, this is a textbook alluvial fan example. This is an extreme example. Others of alluvial fans might not be as obvious. Many times settlement deposition can be gradual and slopes may not be this steep but be covered in grass, or they can be fully developed, but they are a risk and should be considered when developing or if there's existing infrastructures in that area. You can read how FEMA defines alluvial fans, but there is a three-stage process to defining the flood risk in alluvial fans. Stage 1 is recognizing and characterizing alluvial fan formations or landforms. Step 2 is defining inactive and inactive areas of erosion and deposition, where Step 3 is defining the 100-year floodplain for active alluvial fan landforms. And these can be identified as zone AO with a depth and velocity of the firm. But as we saw earlier, some of the older designations can still be zone A, which is an area of risk, but no detailed information has been developed. So in areas of alluvial fans after a wildfire, the flood risk increases dramatically. We have seen examples in Parowan after the Brian Head fire and more recently in California after the Thomas fire in Santa Barbara and the Ventura counties. I wanted to mention that FEMA has recently developed some excellent guidelines and messagings to help communicate the flood risk after wildfire. There is a significant wildfire risk in Utah. So if there is a wildfire close by or within the watershed, you as community officials should immediately consider flood risk and communicate flood protection to your residents. An easy way is to encourage property owners to purchase flood insurance. With the winters we've had so far, it may be a very dry summer. As we present this information, it's not to scare you, but to make you aware that extra planning needs to occur in these areas. This study does not map the flood risk for firm purposes, but it only identifies where observed alluvial fan landforms have been located. The data and information is intended to inform future development of alluvial fan analysis as it relates to flood risk, and at the very least, it can be used for planning purposes at the local level, either for developing or to identify and implement areas where the risk can be mitigated. So with that, if I think we're all set up with our meeting, I'm going to turn this over to Mike to explain the data and the use to develop the study, and we'll provide some examples of the results.
Well, thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I apologize for we try our best to plan to avoid technical glitches, but inevitably it happens. So hopefully you guys are all hearing the audio. I'll put the audio number back up here in case you're having trouble getting that through the WebEx sign-in. There's the phone number and the meeting number. So I'll leave this on for a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the technical elements of this project. I'm going to start with going through all the data that we used to generate our results, and I think it's important to do that so that you can see all the information that was gathered for this study. The first thing we looked at was geologic mapping, both from the U.S. Geological Survey and from the Utah Geological Survey. These acronyms you'll see here, I'll use these throughout the presentation. So the USGS and the UGS have been actively mapping the geology of the Wasatch since at least 1964. These maps, they're not quite comprehensive yet for the whole range front, mostly, but not quite every area. And they're not all of the same scale or resolution. Some are more detailed than others, which were really helpful, but some areas just aren't quite as detailed. So we collected over 50 maps. Some of them were already geo-rectified for GIS, and some that were rectified weren't quite rectified correctly. We had noticed there was some shifting, so we had to make some alterations. But a lot of them were not rectified, so we did that. And in the mapping, and especially the detailed mapping from the UGS, they had already identified many alluvial fan landforms. But their goal wasn't necessarily to look at the sort of the active versus inactive designations that FEMA looks at. So although they identified these landforms, some of them, and they tried to, they do date the landforms with a geologic date. We just were looking at them from a little bit different perspective, from their relative active versus inactive. So we identified some landforms that weren't identified by the UGS, but many of them were already but just identified in a little different way. So the next major data set we used was topo, and we used two large data sets. One, the USGS quadrangle maps that you're all familiar with, the 1 to 24,000 scale maps, which are dated. Those aren't as actively updated anymore, but they do have some really good information on them. The next major data set we used was a free product that it's the multi-agency effort. If you're not familiar with it, it's called Open Topography. It's LiDAR, and hopefully all the communities that are along the Wasatch know about this data. You can get it online. It's really good mapping information. It's at 0.5 meter resolution. So we took that Open Topography and we converted it to 2-foot contour data, which was a really large data set, so we had to, it was really almost unusable because there's so much of it. We had to kind of simplify it down a little bit, but we were able to get 2-foot contours from that. This map on the right of your screen here shows the limits, the extent of that open topography. So you could see that it's quite extensive, covers a lot of the Wasatch, and unfortunately it didn't cover the Oquirrh Mountain area, but that's okay. We made do with what we had. So the reason that the topo data is so important is because alluvial fan landforms, they exhibit unique topographic signatures that help identify them. So by definition, an alluvial fan landform, and Tracy, thank you, did a great job defining alluvial fans in general. That was great. They're a depositional landform, and so they are receiving sediment, and they are depositing sediment consistently over geologic time, and that's what gives them that fan shape. They have channels that move throughout their history, and so that as they're receiving sediment, they create that fan shape. But as part of that, when you look at that expression in contour lines, they create this radial contour pattern. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So on the top, you can see the USGS 1 to 24,000 scale map, and you can see these nice radial contours that are sort of concave in the downstream direction or convex in the downstream direction. And that, when you see that on a map, that should kind of trigger something. Well, this is a different looking landform, and it's because it's receiving these sediments and depositing debris and sediment over time, it creates this topographic signature. And so this is one way to kind of help identify an alluvial fan. And then in the bottom picture is the same location, but using those open topography contours that we built from the LiDAR. And again, you could still see that radial contour pattern. So that's a pretty important thing to help identify these landforms. So the next data set that we used, which was very critical, was aerial photography, both historical and modern. So for the historical data, so over time, as development progresses and agricultural development comes in, and then residential, commercial development comes in, and the land is regraded and changed, sometimes you might lose some of those characteristics that would identify an alluvial fan landform because they've been developed. So going back to older historical aerials is really critical, and it's really critical for any geomorphic study to look at historical photos. The older you can get, the better, the earlier the photo. So we were able to collect over 2,600 digital photos, single photos, spanning from 1937 through 59. And we collected those from lots of different locations. We collected them from the Utah Geological Survey. They have a pretty vast library. We collected them from the U.S. Geological Survey, other sources. And we rectified those photos so that we could get them spatially accurate. This figure on the right here shows the each year of aerial photography that we were able to get and the footprint extent of that. So in a perfect world, we would love to have, old 1937 aerial photos for the entire project area, but they're just not available. They weren't flown for the whole area. So we had to sort of work with what we could find. So this figure shows the extent of each one of these. These photos are available through the state, and so the communities have access to this information. If you contact Jamie, this data is available. We also used, in addition to the historical photos, we used modern aerial photography, primarily the U.S. Department of Agriculture NAPE aerials, which are flown every year. We also used Esri GIS World Imagery. Another data set we used was the FEMA flood hazard layer. So, we wanted to look at where are there existing effective FEMA floodplains that have been mapped, that are, on the maps, and mostly why we wanted to look at this, and we kind of did this towards the tail end of the study once we identified all the landforms, was to see were there FEMA flood zones that were coincident with these identified fan landforms that we found, and not mostly to see how many are there, where are they, but mostly to make the communities aware that they may not be, that FEMA floodplains may not be adequately representing the true type of flooding hazard that's present if just looking at the FEMA floodplains. So we found several locations where we found Zone A floodplains that were coincident with our delineated alluvial fan landforms, and the communities are listed here on this slide. We also found a few locations where we actually had Zone AE floodplains delineated in Layton and Sandy City, again coincident with our identified landforms. And then we did find one in Provo that was an AO zone, which Tracy mentioned before. So alluvial fan floodplains, when you see them on a FEMA firm panel, they are designated as Zone AO, normally with a depth and a velocity component. So we did find an AO floodplain in Provo. Another great data set we found and utilized was Utah Geological Survey hazard mapping. So they are actively the UGS is actively mapping lots of different types of geologic hazards, and they had initiated a project to map flooding hazards along the Wasatch, and they looked at geologic information, they looked at hydrology, they looked at NRCS soils mapping to try to assist communities with identifying the type of flooding hazard that existed along the range front. And so the purpose was to aid communities and agencies in planning. And they classified their flood hazard mapping as very low, low, moderate, and high. And that's the data set you see on the right that is orange and red. That is the UGS flood hazard mapping layer. You know, it's pretty coarse, I guess, in a sense. Basically what they found was that everything downstream from the mountain front into the valley is high hazard flooding, what they considered high hazard flooding, which makes sense. So it's I would say it's sort of somewhat coarse level mapping, but it is useful information to identify where there might be some high hazard flooding. And then the other data set that we used from them was landslide and debris flow mapping. So they've been actively mapping areas where they can identify recent or geologically recent debris flows and landslides. And so we wanted to know, are there any areas that the UGS has mapped landslide or debris flows that are coincident with the alluvial fan landforms that we identified for this study? Okay, so the final sort of data input that we used was a field investigation. So in a perfect world where we had unlimited budget and unlimited schedule, we would have liked to have visited every single one of the identified landforms that we found. We had close to 400 identified. But because we work in the real world under constraints, we had to prioritize which ones we wanted to go see in the field. So we, based on what we looked at, all the data, we kind of came up with a short list of 37. We got input from DEM staff, asked them, are there specific areas that you guys think we should go look at? We showed them all of the field sites that we had planned to go see, and to make sure they were okay with that. And then we went out and did a field investigation. So the goal was to verify the geomorphic characteristics that we were seeing in the aerials, the topo, the geologic mapping, the soils, all that information. We wanted to field verify what we were seeing was real. Is it an alluvial fan? So that was one of the things we wanted to do. We also wanted to observe, record, and photograph what we saw in the field evidence that we identified and interpreted. So we had 170 field photographs. And then we wanted to look at these geomorphic characteristics of active versus inactive in the field and just kind of field calibrate our eyes to what we were seeing in the aerial photos, etc. So we did go out and visit these sites. Most of them were accessible. We could get to them. Some of them were on private land, and we knew that when we picked them, but we felt like they were important enough to at least attempt to try to go see them. So some of them we couldn't get to because of right of entry restrictions, but we went to as many as we could get to. Okay, so the results. So we had our initial identification, the study process, which was what we call the desktop exercise, and that's looking at all the data that I just went through with you. We went out in the field. We looked at, are there engineered structures on these landforms that might be preventing them from being active? In other words, if somebody had previously identified, a community or an agency had identified this as a high hazard landform and constructed a debris basin or a sediment basin or some sort of basin near the fan apex, then that would probably remove it from being an active alluvial fan landform. So sometimes those structures were identifiable in the aerial photos and in the topo, but not always. And then that active versus inactive confirmation. So we took all this information, all the data, all of the field verification stuff, and we came up with a hazard classification for these landforms, either moderate or high. And the high hazard classification, what put them into a high hazard classification was a few of the things. Was there downstream development? Was there either active development or some sort of evidence of development downstream of the landform or on the landform itself? Did our individual fan landform areas intersect the UGS flood hazard high designation or the mapped landslide and debris flow layer? If either one of them or both of them intersected, then we would consider that a high hazard. And then finally, if there was the field evidence indicating a high hazard stuff, geomorphic indicators that we found in the field, then we would classify that as high. Everything else was considered moderate. And then we finally included attributes for the municipality within each hazard. So whether if it was a city, incorporated city, we would make sure that was included. And then if it was unincorporated county, we made sure that was included. So this table on the right here just is a snapshot example of, this isn't all of the landforms, but it's just kind of a snapshot of, for example, in Alpine, we identified one landform that was a moderate hazard and 13 that we would consider high hazard. In Lehigh, we found 3 landforms that would be considered moderate, but 0 that we would consider high hazard. So this table, this information is available in the report at the state. And so really this data, it's quite geographically extensive, and so it's really hard to show on maps. The best way to use this information really is to have the GIS data and look at it in a GIS or some sort of digital platform. But we did include some maps in the report by county, and these are 2 maps from the report. The top left shows Box Elder and Cache counties. The red that you could see on the maps is the high hazard landforms, and the orange is the moderate hazard. And then the bottom right figure is Juab County with high hazard in red and moderate hazard in orange. So again, the scale of this is difficult to really get in and look at where exactly these are, but the GIS data itself is really where the value is. So now I'm going to run through a few specific examples of some locations that I thought would be good to show today. The first one is in North Ogden. You see 2 fan landforms here that we identified. We're going to be looking at the one that's more towards the north. And then this is just a location map to kind of show you where this is. So if there's folks here from North Ogden, you'll recognize the location. It crosses North Ogden Canyon Road here. It's an unnamed watercourse. And so the map on the left, the figure on the left here, is that same delineation landform from the previous screen, but with the modern aerial photo underneath. And I want to kind of point your eye to these sort of bright, contrasted bright areas. These are debris flow lobes and debris flow accumulation. So this figure on the upper right here, this is standing near the fan apex, right up in this area, and it is, whoops, sorry, let me go back. And what I want to point out here is this is looking up the canyon mouth. You could see the scale of the material in the channel. This is the kind of material that's being transported during flood events out of this system. So a huge range of sizes. You could see large boulders. You can also see cobbles and then coarse gravels. But this is the bed of the channel. So this is what gets transported during flood events. Then the figure at the bottom is looking down here on the fan, standing down on the main part of the fan, looking downstream. And this street that you could see in the photo is this unfinished cul-de-sac, at least as of the date of this photo. So there's some active development happening down here. And you can see what we're looking at in the center of the photo here on the bottom right is a debris lobe from a debris flow that came down and was deposited on the surface. One other interesting thing to note, you can see these houses kind of in the background of this photo. Now these are just off of the photograph on the left, the aerial. They're just below here. But when we were out in the field, we saw that many of these homes had a pile of boulders kind of in their yard. It looked like just a spoil pile they were just getting rid of. And my conclusion from that was that, because they didn't seem to be in any sort of formal landscape orientation or that they were being used for landscaping. And my thought was, well, they were probably boulders that were found as they did landscape improvements. They didn't want these big boulders in their yard, so they would dig them up and they would pile them up to get rid of them at some point. But I guess I'd want you to kind of think about, why those boulders are there. Why do all these people have these big piles of boulders in their yard? Because these boulders were brought down through debris flow and deposited, and then over time they were probably buried and with finer sediments. And so it kind of gives you a scale of the dynamic of the system that's going on here. Okay, so now we'll jump to another example. This is also in North Ogden. This is Barrett Canyon, if you're familiar with that system. This is kind of a map of where this is at. So the figure on the left, again, is an aerial photo. And this is a very interesting location. So there are several debris or alluvial fan landforms along the range front here. And many of them have been identified previously and have these debris basins constructed near the fan apex. So this is a pretty massive structure. I'm not really sure who built this, if this was a developer or if the community built this, the city or the county, but it's a pretty big structure, and it seems to be doing a pretty adequate job of catching large debris flows that come out of this system. But if we look at this one here on the left, the one that we mapped, you can see another debris basin here that appears to have been constructed to protect some infrastructure here. We've got, I believe this is probably a municipal water source. I'm not positive, but that would be my guess. And this is protecting all of this stuff. But and so at some time, the fan has come over this way and may have flown right, have debris flows and flooding right through this area. But there has been some shifting over time, and I'm not positive if this was a one-time flood avulsion or exactly how this evolved, but the channel is now going over this way. So it's really not going into this debris basin any longer. If it does avulse this way, this will probably do something to protect this infrastructure, but really it's not protecting what is now the active area of the fan. The channel now goes down and flows this direction. So again, you can see these kind of brighter areas of active deposition. And if we look at the photo on the upper right, this is standing near the fan apex, somewhere right up in here, looking downstream. And again, just note the size of the material in the bed of the channel, large boulders, cobbles, lots of gravels, and just big material. And then the photo at the bottom right is looking at inside the basin. And the basin has a pretty significant volume of storage. But a really big debris flow could easily fill this basin in one event. and maybe even fill it and cause overtopping. So structures like this, just need to be maintained as events occur. And we saw these kind of debris basins in a lot of different places up and down the Wasatch. I'm sure you are familiar with, if you have these in your communities, where they are, and they're generally very effective as long as they're maintained. So the final example I wanted to show to get off of the Wasatch Range over to the Oquirrh Mountains was in Tooele County. Big Canyon is the name of the watercourse, and that's the one there in the middle. So this is, again, just kind of a map to show you about where it is. So, again, see this sort of brighter depositional area representing more recent debris flow activity on this landform. This photo on the upper right is taken up here near the apex, and you can see there's a large debris lobe here with lots of big material, lots of boulders kind of strewn throughout the surface. But what's particularly interesting here is there's been what appears to be what I would call an FRS, or a flood retarding structure, that's been built. Probably, my assumption was to protect this community, but it begins here and it runs along the sort of bottom part of the fan and then runs along here. And this is a photo looking at that FRS, and it's just a mound. Somebody's come along and dug a kind of a trench from behind and then put the dirt up here to build this flood retarding structure. And these kind of structures can be very effective, especially this far down the fan, where primarily most of the bigger debris is probably going to be deposited in a debris flow up on the upper part of the fan, but there could be some debris that makes it down this far. You can see these large boulders on the surface here by the FRS, and so definitely debris can make it down this far. And these can be effective, again, if they're maintained, but it certainly is possible that in a really big flood event, this could fill up and overtop with debris. I don't know the status if this would be considered a FEMA certified structure. If a FEMA flood map were to be proposed in this area, if this is a FEMA certified levee, it's possible, but it may not be. In which case, in that sort of situation, they would either have to get it certified, or it wouldn't be included as in the flood hazard analysis. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn the time back over to Tracy to conclude the presentation. Tracy? Tracy, you're muted.
Ambulance 32, and medic engine 32.
Well, that wasn't me.
9875 South Sandridge Drive on 1520 East.
Tracy, are you on?
I am on. If you can hear me. Hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
75 South Sandridge Drive.
I'm not sure about the emergency alert.
Can somebody mute that if whatever that is? Thank you.
There we go. Okay, so this slide is the same slide you saw earlier, but we wanted to reiterate that the information you've seen here has identified areas that need a closer look or additional data or information when developing or planning future developments. Our goal is to ensure that when an event occurs, that damage is minimized and your property owners and businesses are safe from the impacts of both debris and flood risks in the area. As we mentioned earlier, if you want to flip this slide, this data is going to be available to you, and if you would like a copy or have any questions about the study, you can please contact Jamie Huff or Mike for any technical questions. Again, we're going to be posting the webinar on the DM Risk Map website, and Jamie has been talking to AGRC about adding this data to the AGRC Utah mapping portal. More information on this will come as she kind of finishes up that process. So at this time, I'd like to thank you for joining, and we're going to open this up for questions. So if you have a question, if you could just please type that into the chat window, and Mike, if you're able to maybe answer some of those. Jamie, I know, is still on the phone, so if it runs into wrist maps, she might be able to answer some of those messages back, and we can go ahead and end our recording.